Hello, and welcome back to Sustainability Mindshift, where we are exploring what it takes to be a sustainability leader today, including the skills and the capabilities and the mindsets that are critical for success. We are very lucky and honored to have Zoe Arden with us today. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Brad.
Let me just tell you a little bit about Zoe before we get started. I can't wait for this episode. Zoe is an independent leadership communications specialist who is an expert in leadership, stakeholder engagement, and storytelling. She's passionate about enabling individuals to build their capability to lead courageously. And we'll be talking about that today. Maximize their positive influence and impact, and create stories that drive change. Through her work, Zoe helps organizations craft compelling purpose-centered learning programs. She's also a fellow at Cambridge University's Institute for Sustainability Leadership, also called CISL for those of you that have heard of that, where she's currently the co-convener and the convener of 2 online courses for existing and aspiring leaders. One of them is called Communicating for Influence and Impact, and the other is called High Impact Leadership. Both excellent courses. I recommend you check them out. She's also creating a 3rd course right now called Women Leading Change, Shaping Our Future. Zoe draws on 3 decades of global business experience, 13 of which were spent in a managing director or director level role in complex organizations, including the global advisory firm Sustainability, a well-known sustainability consulting firm. I remember that very well, which is now part of ERM. Also, she was a director at British Telecom and a global communications consultancy, Golan, among others. She's also co-author and contributor of research and reports on leadership development and experiential learning. Now, that is exactly how and where I was introduced to Zoe and where I found her excellent research and thesis online. But welcome, Zoe. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, lovely to be here, Brad, and thank you for that super introduction.
Yeah. And I'd love to start there. So the experiential learning piece has been something that we've been exploring, and we're going to continue to explore as, in our minds, a very powerful methodology for teaching leadership and helping shift mindsets for this new age of transformation. But I was really impressed with the work that you were doing on your thesis, and I found you to be one of the pioneers in that space, actually. So tell me a little bit more about that. Why experiential learning? Why leadership development as things that you saw as key?
Yeah, great question. So absolutely, I think experiential learning really is the backbone to all of my work and the real inspiration. And actually, my personal story goes back to when I was doing a master's in sustainability leadership at Cambridge, and that was back in 2012. And I'd done the first year, all of the theory around sustainability and leadership. And at the end of that first year, I actually went to Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world in southern Africa. And I felt for the first time I was seeing these sustainability topics through my own eyes. So, literally seeing what it was like for someone who lived next to the biggest freshwater lake in the world, but could only afford to eat fish 2 or 3 times a year. Or looking at a hilltop and seeing that half of it was completely deforested because that was the policy of that district, and the other half of the hilltop that had trees was the policy of another district. And then probably the third example was going to meet an old childhood friend of my husband's who was born in Malawi, and finding that he was a man in his 70s, surrounded by 15 grandchildren, and his children had all died of AIDS. So I felt suddenly, for the first time, these social, economic, and environmental issues, I was actually seeing them with my own eyes. And it was a result of that experience. And then coming back to London, where I live, and my next door neighbours had bought this massive gas guzzling kind of 4x4. Everybody was like this on their phones. No one was engaging. Traffic had come to an absolute standstill in the town where I live because the sewers had been blocked by this fatberg that was the size of a double-decker bus from all the rubbish that were people throwing into the sewers. So I just had this just completely discombobulating experience of what it was like in one of the poorest countries in the world, which, by the way, where people were connecting and just really actually, just making the most of what they had, to coming back to where I lived and seeing the other side of the coin, which was overconsumption, people disconnected, stuck on their devices, the problems that we were causing in our infrastructure through how we were using and misusing resources. And I was like, okay, stop. And so it was a result of that experience that made me want to focus my master's thesis on experiential learning.
You
Because
had
I
your
had
own, clearly you had your own experience right there that was eye-opening. It's interesting that's one way to help leaders today is the immersive travel component, where you actually bring people into the field like that to see that for their own, to understand a new have a new way of looking at the world, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And then subsequently, I did a Leaders Quest. I'm not sure if you've come across Leaders Quest.
Yeah,
They actually specialize in that whole sort of experience for business leaders. And I went to Israel and Palestine and immersed myself in those very intractable issues in that part of the world. So, so my master's thesis was looking at the impact of experiential learning programs on business leaders' attitudes to sustainability. The idea that we actually have to see these things with fresh eyes, connect with them through our hearts, and then think about what's the role that we can play in actually helping contribute to solutions to these big problems.
And you, through that process too, did you have somebody that you could speak to? Because I know a big piece of the programs that make them powerful too is not just the witnessing of these things, but also having the opportunity to share how you feel about it, observing other people's feelings and perspectives, and reflecting a lot on what you've seen, and then how that applies back, which you did naturally, it sounds like, just through your own observation, internal reflection, and then applying it back to the society you came back to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that unpacking it with others, the meaning making piece of those experiences, what they mean for you, what you can contribute in terms of solutions to some of the global sustainability challenges that otherwise can just feel very theoretical. We happen to be sitting in, very comfortable surroundings. We know that the electricity is going to turn on. We know that the water is going to come out of the tap generally, and that we know that we're going to be able to put food in our bellies. But obviously, that's not the case in many parts of the world. So you're absolutely right. It's how do we make sense of this? How do we unpack it? And I think the bigger question, actually, which is something I explored a lot, because I looked at lots and lots of experiential learning programs, talking to many organizations, is how do we keep that experience fresh, so that actually we recommit to do something about it? Because otherwise you can have an experience and actually it can have the opposite effect. So you go back into your daily working environment, your emails have gone sky high, you've got even more pressing business, and actually it can just make you a bit disconnected from what's going on in your day to day, as opposed to thinking, how can we be part of solving these issues? How can we use our strengths as individuals and our strengths as organizations? So I think that moment, as you said, that point of reflecting and renewing is very important. And sometimes we can just do a kind of sheep dip experience for people. They have a moment of nirvana or whatever it might be, and actually, but there's no longevity to it. So I think that's absolutely the key with these programs.
Amazing. I wonder, Brad, is it okay for me to already shift this to storytelling and the aspects there, or all right? Because what I feel for me personally is that stories, and well-told stories specifically, can be almost an experience in itself, that you can through empathy feel the experiences that another person is communicating. And I guess that is what music really does to it. And I like this idea of a story being the experience, but not perhaps can be a metaphor for things as well, so that it doesn't become here's the exact data points, here's the theoretical knowledge that you should just pack into your brain, but rather this old traditional way that stories has been used for millennia, of where it's invoking something inside the listener. But so I want to hear, like, how did you come from this background going into your role today of more working with storytelling, and how are you doing that today?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great reflection, Malcolm. Absolutely, like stories can do that, as you said. Like stories, in fact, go back thousands and thousands of years to when we were living in caves, and enabled us to make sense of what was going on in the world. And nowadays, obviously, we are just deluged with information. And again, stories can create a connection. The details of stories are sticky, and stories are also a great way of bringing in other perspectives. So it's like a mini experiential learning program. If you tell a story and you connect with someone, it that can also sort of drop the scales from your eyes. So the story ingredient that I particularly like that does that is when you tell an anecdote. You're painting a picture. You're enabling someone to imagine what that was like, and it's a way of bringing other stakeholders into the room. So I could tell you a picture about a woman who invited me to lunch in her hut, by the side of Lake Malawi, and you can start to get a sense of what that was like. So absolutely, for me, I'm really passionate about the importance of stories as a way of enabling us to connect as humans and to connect to what's important and what matters, and also then to create a willingness to want to act. So it's like, what can we spark in someone else? And as you said, like you referenced music, there are different things that we can bring in that creates transformation in individuals, that actually makes them want to take action.
So go ahead, Nelker, you have follow up.
Yeah, I just find this the making people want to act is such a hard question of mine, because like with this topic of sustainability and climate change and all of that, it can be so overwhelming. There's so much doom and gloom and negativity, and I feel like there is such a vast need for empowerment, and not naive positivity, but invoking a sense of empowerment in people to want to act. And in the other podcast I'm hosting called The Decade, we are playing with the notion of that we want to make sustainability sexy, because we want people to want to do it, because I think it has to come from within with people, not a shameful that do this, do that, but how can we make people want to be contributors for the good of sustainability of this world?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to comment back on that, I completely agree. Whether it's making sustainability sexy, making sustainability cool, accessible, not making it a guilt-laden activity. So, for example, I'm a strategic advisor to an environmental charity here in the UK called Hubbub, 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 and that is all around, making sustainability fun, aspirational, something that you use in your day-to-day life. It's those little changes that we can make. And I think, as you said, it's so easy to disconnect and feel that it's about doom and gloom, feel paralyzed. And actually, I firmly believe that change happens one person at a time. We've seen these individuals that have appeared, whether it's someone like Malala or Greta, or these individuals that have courage to stand up and inspire others. And we can all do that in our own context.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, and as you're talking about storytelling, I'm, just thinking about the power of storytelling today with the increase in companies that have sustainability reports. And then there's been a real shift, in that direction, I think, in telling a story around this issue of purpose. So instead of just kind of putting data out there, which I know ESG is very data intensive, that piece of it, but companies are also being more considerate of what is our purpose and how do we tell that how do we share that purpose in a story format to our stakeholders, employees and customers and suppliers, et cetera, to inspire them in ways that help them understand the direction we're going and really engage them in the process. And hopefully, as an end result, create more collaborative opportunities, I think, around that, those stories. So what do you think are like the key elements? You've mentioned a few of them of, when you're teaching a class on storytelling, what are some of the key elements of telling a good story?
Sure. Well, I talk about the 5 stages of story. So how do we go from storytelling to story being? Because actually we're telling a story before we even open our mouths. So are we, as individuals, are we conveying passion for our topic? Are we connected to our purpose? You use that language, Brad. Are we inspiring others, or is this, are we just sort of like have no energy? So firstly, it's how do we move from storytelling to story being? So there are 5 steps of story that I talk about, and the first one is story listening. We absolutely have to start by listening and putting ourselves in our stakeholders' shoes. No one's interested in our stories or our problems. People are interested in, what can you do to help me solve my problems? So it's, really, and again, it goes back to the whole experiential piece. It's like walking in the shoes of someone else. I mean, it's an old adage that you need to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And actually we do that very, very little. So I'd say the first ingredient is starting with story listening and really putting ourselves in the shoes of our stakeholders, which interestingly enough, people tend to find quite difficult.
Really? Tell us more. How does that show up?
Well, how's that show up? So often I do an exercise, which is walking in your stakeholder shoes. And so firstly, I'll get people to think about, okay, who are your key stakeholders? And they tend to think about groups. So they'll think about suppliers or finance. Often it will start we're very internal. So we'll think about our internal stakeholders first. We'll think about our boss. And it's interesting how often people don't even think about their external stakeholders at all. So firstly, people think about groups, and then you really dig deeper and go, okay, now think about an individual. Think about an individual. When you think about your biggest goal that you're trying to achieve, who is the individual that can help you accelerate that goal, or might perhaps be a bit of a blocker at the moment? So then eventually we get the name of a human being. And then I get people to walk in that person's shoes and just answer a series of questions. So what keeps you awake at night? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What are you most proud of? If you had a magic wand, what would you wish to achieve? So answering these as if you were wearing the shoes of your most important stakeholder. And people find it really difficult. So it's a big aha moment. It's like, okay, you're creating your stories. You're wanting to create change, and yet you know nothing about the most important stakeholder that you're trying to connect with.
Which is the probably number one rule of storytelling is understand your audience, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm getting distracted. I just need to put my power source in. I'll be carrying on. This is live.
It's okay.
I don't want to cut the story short by having a power outage.
I've moved into my posh space, and I realized I hadn't
plugged in.
I'm not plugged in.
Yep.
Apologies. Right.
Part of being human and dealing with technology.
It's all about finding our energy, finding our juice, right? So that's what stories do.
Excellent. That's right.
All good.
I want to continue hearing, Melker. It looks like we both have so many questions, as you can tell. I don't know if there's any way to go back also to, you were starting to talk about the key elements of storytelling, and you said story listening or story being and story listening.
Yeah. So perhaps why don't I just quickly say what I think the 5 aspects of story are. So one It starts with story listening. So put yourself in the shoes of your stakeholders and create your stories from their perspective, the people that you want to influence, the people that you want to take action. Then it's story building. So what are the ingredients we need? And I use the analogy of, so you've walked in your stakeholders' shoes, you now know what kind of cake they like to eat. So what are the ingredients that you need to bring together to make the perfect story cake for your stakeholders? So from story listening to story building. And again, the analogy, we don't just put on our running shoes and go out and run, a marathon. It takes time to build our story muscle. So it's like, how do we make that into a practice? The third one is storytelling. So that's where actually we build our story, and we can talk more about the ingredients that are absolutely essential elements of story. But then it's storytelling. How do we get feedback? We're all on the wrong side of our own eyeballs. So how do we make sure that we've got that feedback loop, that we know that actually we're telling an effective story? Step 4 is story doing. So how can we create organizations that are built around that sense of purpose? A story doing organization ensures that everybody understands the story of the organization, the North Star, the organization's purpose. Everybody from the person at the front desk, to the guy the guy or gal in the post room, to the people that are moving the trucks around. So does everyone understand what the organization's purpose is, its biggest story, including suppliers, customers? We know purpose-driven brands that do that really, really well. So story doing is step 4, and then story. The 5th step is story being. So that's very much around our leadership, how we catalyzing our personal leadership, how we bringing that courage, the capabilities, and the confidence, so that we can actually live and breathe our stories.
I love that. And if we could pause just for a second and think about the last 2 stages, and the reason that's sort of hitting home to me is, I know that this is the decade of action, and the UN is calling for more organizations to do more, right? So the story doing piece really is taking your words that you've been, so many organizations have all these words that they say, goals, objectives, strategies, and really implementing them successfully, and being ambitious enough to set, goals that are slightly beyond reach even. But I love this transition from, because a lot of the talk now is, doing, get it done. But the being part is fascinating to me, because that takes it to a whole nother level. If we think about organizational execution, and not just doing in terms of going down a list and ticking things off and saying, okay, I've done that, but saying this is where the sort of regenerational mindset and mindset shifting in my mind comes in, because it's really about understanding sustainability, and through action and experience, the doing part, you're transforming yourself as an individual to another level, and you're transforming your culture in the organization such that it becomes just the way of being, the way of doing things naturally, as opposed to having to force it or tick off boxes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see it as circular in a way. I mean, it's not a linear process. It's like story being feeds right back into story listening again. And I think, as you said, it's not just about ticking off a bunch of things. You referenced ESG earlier, and all that important stuff. It's not just doing for the sake of doing, or doing to make us look good. There's the shadow side of story gets us into fiction and spin, communication spin, PR, etc. So the doing has absolutely got to be connected with your purpose as an individual, and your purpose as an organization. And I loved what you said about goals that are beyond reach, because for me it's the listening piece, and the stories about how do we connect with really diverse stakeholders? How do we make sure that we're collaborating with people that we don't even know yet? Because actually it's that that goes beyond reach, to use your language. We can't start to create a shift. We can't solve system level issues doing them in our own little bubble. We absolutely have to be working with all different types of collaborators, go in without knowing the answers, and perhaps without even knowing the questions, but how we turning up, and how do we collaborate to create really new innovative solutions and make sure that everyone's part of that process.
Mm-hmm. I just love this. This resonates so well with me in my the experiences I've had in just recent memory, where without going into detail, I just organized a swim run race where we're really trying to convey a premium experience. And for some time I felt like, and perhaps still do to a certain degree, that premiumness in a consumerist society is an obstacle with sustainability. And I had this person give me a mindset shift of, but if you can, as in your words now, like do the story doing and the story being, like living out the purpose that I have for the business, and aligning that in my communication and conveying that to the stakeholders, primarily the officials of the race and the customers, the participants of the race, that then that can itself perhaps be the premium experience that I'm looking for. And I don't have to have different face masks on for different settings. So it feels like aligning that should be so much more empowering for myself. And I just sense that this is a really interesting shift of when you can really align your values to the stories that you're telling. Super happy you brought that up.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really great point, Malcolm. And I often reflect on the fact that, the world we're in is becoming like increasingly polarized, and we're all very much now silos. We've got social media like dishing out algorithms which sort of tend to narrow our focus or get us more extreme in our way of thinking. And what you're describing is like, how can you use story in your communication actually to build bridges? And how can it be value based? Like your example of the conversations that you're having with the organizers, etc. How can you be living the values and demonstrating the values that you're trying to bring to that particular example?
Absolutely.
Yeah, powerful way for brands to connect, I'm sure, and when you have your stakeholders viscerally, sensing your organization's purpose and having a role in that, and feeling like they're playing a role in it, like with Melker's swim run. Not only were they athletes that were there to compete and get exercise, doing something healthy outdoors. I'm sure they all, most of them enjoy that. In addition to the fact that they're participating in your story, they're participating in this organization that you've created that has, commitments to sustainability and has a bigger picture that they can literally feel as they're out there in the race as well, in addition to everything else that's going on, all the other stimulation that they're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think two things I'd say there, which is, one, so going back to story, is it's about the micro moments of influence and impact. So it's the conversation that you have perhaps on the start line. If we continue with the swim run example, the conversation that you have with someone on the start line of what this means to you. It's the conversation that you have with the official perhaps or the local bureaucrat who isn't quite sure if they want to approve this yet. So I'm a real believer in actually, how do we give people the skills, the capability, and help them build the stories to make the most of these micro moments of influence and impact, because that's what counts. And part of that is, how do we make sure that we can bring ourselves up sort of out of the weeds of what we're doing, because we're all dealing with huge amounts of complexity and problems, and we're solving things day to day. How do we bring ourselves up to this 50,000 foot level and think, what's my takeaway message that I want people to get? And that literally is a couple of sentences. So, for example, to give you an example, when I do storytelling training, my takeaway message for participants is 8 words. Truthful stories, powerfully told, can drive transformational change. So, truthful stories, powerfully told, can drive transformational change. And that took me days. I mean, you can imagine there's a lot of unpacking, but it's,
a lot.
that's a story skill, which is absolutely essential these days. We need something really sticky. And then, of course, there's layers underneath it, but you're not in control of what people take out of the room once they've had a conversation with you. So how can you get yourself lined up to be as successful as possible and make sure that you've got your own takeaway message based on everything that you're doing, your purpose, what you're trying to achieve, your mission? That's the work. That's building the story muscle.
I think that's a great place for us to end this. Although I hate to end it because I think I'm gonna reiterate the phrase again that you used. Truthful stories, powerfully told, can drive transformational change. I think we could spend a whole podcast, unpacking that one, as you said. But you've been a wonderful guest, very inspiring, Zoe. Great to have you on the show, and appreciate your time so much.
Yeah, thank you both for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, Zoe.
Cheers.